It was one of those rare, golden mornings in St. Mary Mead when even the old stones of the church seemed to bask in contentment. The air was crisp, scented faintly with the last blooms of summer, and the first hint of autumn decay. Miss Jane Marple, in her neat straw hat trimmed with faded blue ribbon, was trimming the roses that clambered loyally against her garden wall. Few things in life delighted her more than observing the world through the rhythm of ordinary village life. The postman's punctuality, the vicar's sermons growing progressively shorter with the approach of the harvest FT, and the mysterious increase in jam sales at Mrs. Bartlett's grocer every time a certain bachelor came visiting. To most these were trivialities. To Miss Marple, they were fragments of human nature, which, like roses, always revealed their true colors under a little sunlight and careful pruning. That morning, however, the tranquility of St. Mary Mead was soon to be disturbed. It began, as many small disturbances do, with a letter. A letter from Hetherington Hall. Miss Marple found the envelope propped neatly between her Morning Post. A light cream stationery with the crest of Hetherington Hall embossed in gold. She raised her brows. The hall had been empty for nearly 15 years, ever since Sir Reginald Hetherington passed away, and his widow retired to Bath. Rumours had fluttered for weeks that it had been sold to a new owner. A certain Lady Eleanor Fortescue, a woman of means and mystery. Miss Marple opened the envelope delicately with a paper knife. Inside was a short, elegantly penned note. My dear Miss Marple, I have been strongly recommended to seek your acquaintance by our mutual friend, Colonel Melchett, who speaks of your remarkable insight into the more delicate intricacies of human behavior. Might I prevail upon you to take tea with me this afternoon at 4? There is a small matter on which I should value a lady's perspective. Yours sincerely, Eleanor Fortescue, Lady Hetherington Hall. A small matter, murmured Miss Marple, setting the letter down beside her teacup. It's always a small matter, until it becomes a very large one indeed. By 3:30, she was ready. A light grey coat, sensible shoes, gloves, and a hat with no pretensions. She left her cottage just as the church clock chimed the half-hour, the path from the lane leading her past the vicarage, where she exchanged polite greetings with Mrs. Clement, and through the tall wrought iron gates of Hetherington Hall. The return of Hetherington Hall. The hall had changed, yet not entirely. The ivy was trimmed, the gravel drive newly raked, but the great oak doors retained their quiet dignity, as though they remembered centuries of gossip, scandal, and whispered love affairs. Miss Marple was greeted by a butler, solemn and silver-haired, who ushered her into a sunlit drawing-room filled with soft chintz, polished brass, and the faint scent of lavender. Lady Eleanor Fortescue rose to greet her, tall, composed, perhaps in her late 50s, with the kind of beauty that had once been striking and was now dignified. Her eyes, however, held something restless, a flicker of unease beneath the refinement. Miss Marple, how perfectly delightful to meet you. I've heard much of your insight. Insight, Lady Fortescue, said Miss Marple with a mild smile. I shouldn't think I have more than any woman who's lived a little and listened much. Lady Fortescue gave a soft, distracted laugh. How very true. Do sit down, please. Tea was brought, the sort of tea service that spoke of impeccable breeding, delicate china, silver spoons, lemon slices cut paper thin. Lady Fortescue poured with graceful precision, yet her hands trembled ever so slightly. It's rather delicate, she began, stirring her tea though she had added no sugar. You see, I've recently come into possession of this house through my late husband, Reginald Fortescue. You may have heard the name. Miss Marple inclined her head. Indeed. Banker, was he not? Retired just before the war. Yes, he passed some 5 years ago, and well, I've chosen to live here to restore the Hall. Yet since my arrival, there have been curious things. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Someone leaves roses at my door each morning, white roses. Always one single bloom. Miss Marple, stirring her tea, looked thoughtful. How romantic, she murmured softly. Romantic. Lady Fortescue gave a faint, almost startled laugh. Yes, that was my first thought, but I've come to believe it's something else. You see. She paused, glanced toward the window. The roses are placed precisely where my first fiancé used to meet me, long before I married Reginald. Said Miss Marple gently. The first love. Lady Fortescue nodded slowly. Captain Edmund Lacey. He died, or was believed to have died, in the war, and yet, these roses began appearing the very day I arrived here. As though he had returned. There was a silence. Outside, a blackbird trilled in the elm trees. Miss Marple looked at the woman's strained face and thought of many things. Of memory, of regret, and of how love can leave its scent in the air long after it has gone. "Tell me, Lady Fortescue," she said quietly, "do you employ a gardener?" "Two, actually. Old Mr. Digby, who's been here for decades, and a young fellow, Peter Shaw, new, enthusiastic, a bit rough perhaps." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly. "And both have access to the rose garden?" "Of course." "Then perhaps," said Miss Marple gently, "the question is not who leaves the roses, but why they are left at all." Tea tension, and whispered names over tea. Lady Fortescue introduced her house guests. There was Mr. Geoffrey Lacey, her late fiancé's younger brother, now a solicitor, respectable but reserved, with the same striking grey eyes that might once have belonged to the dead Edmund. Then there was Miss Clara Denham, Lady Fortescue's paid companion, a quiet, observant woman in her 40s, given to silence and nervous smiles. Reverend Arthur Stokes, the new vicar of St. Mary Mead, was also a frequent visitor at the hall, earnest, scholarly, and possessed of a compassion that sometimes crossed the borders of discretion. Finally, there was Peter Shaw the gardener, lean, sunburnt, and clearly uncomfortable under Miss Marple's gentle gaze when she encountered him later in the garden. It was, in Miss Marple's opinion, quite the assortment. And as any good village observer knows, an assortment of personalities always means an assortment of motives. A whisper from the past. Before Miss Marple took her leave, Lady Fortescue handed her a small envelope. "This arrived yesterday," she said. "It was slipped beneath my door in the night." Miss Marple examined it. Thick cream paper, faintly scented with rosewater. Inside, a single card bore the words, "Do you remember the promise you made beneath the roses?" "I do." Miss Marple replaced the card, and looked at Lady Fortescue calmly. "And you made such a promise?" Lady Fortescue gave a short, trembling sigh. "Every young girl makes promises, Miss Marple. Some are foolish enough to keep them." As she walked home that evening, the sky burnished in amber and violet, Miss Marple reflected that Lady Fortescue's small matter might not remain small for long. Promises, after all, had a way of binding people, and in her long experience, the dead were sometimes more troublesome than the living. The night at Hetherington Hall, it was just past 11 when the scream shattered the quiet of the hall. Mrs. Crampton, the housekeeper, would later swear she heard it coming from the west wing, Lady Fortescue's rooms. By the time the staff arrived, the corridor smelled faintly of crushed roses. The door was locked from within. When Geoffrey Lacey and Reverend Stokes broke it open, they found Lady Fortescue lying across her writing desk, a half-finished letter beneath her hand, and a single white rose resting beside it. She was quite dead, no wound, no struggle. The doctor later said it was poison, digitalis, cleverly administered, and in the corner of the desk lay a small overturned tea cup, its contents spilling across the lace cloth. A village aflame with gossip by morning, St. Mary Mead was buzzing like a disturbed hive. At the post office Mrs. Hartnell declared that ladies who came from Bath were always a bit touched. At the grocer's Mrs. Bartlett swore she'd seen the young gardener Peter Shaw arguing with Lady Fortescue only 2 days before. At the vicarage Mrs. Clement said it was so terribly sad. Poor woman, all alone with her memories. And at her little house by the church, Miss Marple was knitting calmly by the window, her blue eyes thoughtful. She had already spoken to Inspector Craddock. Polite, methodical, but inclined to think it suicide, Miss Marple disagreed quietly. "No," she said, "a lady does not poison herself," and then lay a rose beside her hand. The rose was for an audience. "An audience?" asked Craddock. "Yes. Someone wanted the scene to tell a story. Of love, of remorse perhaps. But one must never believe the story a murderer tells, Inspector. One must look for the one he does not tell." Craddock frowned. "You mean to say this is staged?" "Beautifully," said Miss Marple softly, "almost lovingly staged." She paused, looked up from her knitting. "But love, Inspector, can be the most dangerous motive of all." End of ACTI. Miss Marple folded her knitting, stood up, and gazed out toward the spire of St. Mary Mead's church. Somewhere, a clock struck noon. She could almost feel the threads of deceit tightening in the village air, threads spun by jealousy, memory, and that most fatal illusion of all, the first love. For it was seldom forgotten. And sometimes it killed. Morning sunlight fell through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's parlor, dappling the carpet like quiet gold. Her teapot steamed gently beside the tray, and her needles clicked in steady rhythm. To any casual observer, she was a picture of serenity, the elderly spinster at her knitting, content and undisturbed. But behind those mild blue eyes, the mind of St. Mary Mead's sharpest observer was already at work. Inspector Craddock's report lay open before her. Lady Eleanor Fortescue deceased. Digitalis poisoning, likely ingested through her evening tea. Cup found overturned, no signs of forced entry. The room locked from within. Death estimated between 10 and 11 o'clock. Suicide, that was the official suggestion. Yet Miss Marple's instincts prickled in quiet protest. She knew human nature far too well to accept such tidy endings. People seldom die tidily, she murmured. Least of all when they have secrets. The scene of the crime. By mid-morning, Miss Marple found herself once again walking up the gravel path to Hetherington Hall. The house was shrouded in the muted atmosphere that always follows sudden death. Blinds half drawn, servants whispering in corridors, the air heavy with the scent of lilies hastily arranged in the drawing-room. Inspector Craddock met her at the entrance. "I thought you might turn up, Miss Marple," he said, managing a wry smile. "Such things do rather pique one's curiosity, don't they?" She replied mildly. "You've seen the room, of course." He nodded, leading her up the staircase. Door locked from inside, key found in the lock. Poison in the teacup, laboratory confirmed digitalis. "We've interviewed everyone. No one saw anyone enter or leave her rooms." Miss Marple glanced at the carpet runner as they climbed. "And yet," she said softly, "death is never as private as it seems. Someone always watches, if not with their eyes, then with their intentions." The room itself was almost precisely as described. The writing desk by the window, the letter half finished, the teacup overturned beside it, a small vase held, of course, a single white rose. Miss Marple approached it slowly. "Curious," she said, bending slightly. "Do you notice, Inspector, the petal edges? They're bruised, handled roughly. Whoever placed it here did not do so gently. And see, a faint trace of soil beneath the stem. The rose was not cut this morning, it was taken some hours before." Craddock made a note. "You think it was brought here deliberately?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "it was meant as a message." She turned to the desk, where the half-written letter lay. The ink had dried mid-sentence. "My dearest Geoffrey, there is something I must tell you about Edmund." "And nothing more?" Miss Marple's brows lifted. Well, a letter to Mr. Geoffrey Lacey. How very intriguing." The house and its inhabitants, Lady Fortescue's guests and household, were gathered in the morning-room. Pale faces, subdued voices, and the unmistakable air of people pretending composure while quietly terrified of exposure. Miss Marple took them in with the calm scrutiny of a botanist studying unfamiliar plants. Each told its own story. Geoffrey Lacey, standing by the fireplace, appeared the picture of restrained grief. Yet beneath his polished manners, there was a hardness to his mouth, something that suggested anger more than sorrow. Miss Clara Denham, the companion, sat with folded hands and downcast eyes. Every so often, she twisted a handkerchief between her fingers, as though to stop them trembling. Reverend Arthur Stokes stood near the window, his expression one of gentle bewilderment. He spoke little, except to murmur platitudes about divine mystery and human frailty. Peter Shaw, the gardener, hovered at the edge of the group, cap in hand, clearly ill at ease. His boots were mud-stained, his manner defiant. Miss Marple settled herself primly on a small chair, and began what she called the pleasant art of listening. 1. The companion story. Miss Clara Denham was the first to speak when Miss Marple asked, ever so gently, "You were quite devoted to her ladyship, I believe?" "Oh yes, Miss Marple. She was kind, very kind, though sometimes melancholy." A woman of memories. "Yes, she spoke often of Captain Lacey, her first love. She said she never truly forgot him, even after she married Sir Reginald." Clara hesitated. "She kept some of his letters, and a photograph, in a silver frame." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Sentiment is a dangerous indulgence, Miss Denham, particularly when it falls into the wrong hands. Did anyone else know of these mementos?" "I don't know. She kept them locked away in a little drawer in her desk." "But," Clara faltered, "I once saw her reading one by candlelight. She looked so haunted." Miss Marple said nothing. She merely nodded, the needles of her mind quietly clicking together. 2. The gardener's account. Peter Shaw's turn came next. He looked uncomfortable under the scrutiny of Miss Marple's kindly blue eyes. "I heard you tended the rose gardens, Mr. Shaw," she said pleasantly. "Such beautiful blooms, particularly the white ones." He shifted. "Yes, ma'am. Been looking after 'em since I came here. 6 months now." "And you often picked them for the house?" "Sometimes, yes. Her ladyship liked them in her rooms." "And these single roses, the ones left by her door each morning, that was your doing?" He started. "No, ma'am. Never left no flowers by her door. Curious, Miss Marple murmured, because whoever did so must have had access to the garden before dawn, and few would rise so early, except a gardener. Shaw flushed.
I tell you, it weren't me.
Maybe that other gardener, old Digby. He's been here years. Knows every corner o' the place. Indeed. Miss Marple's tone remained mild. And did you notice anything unusual last evening? He hesitated. Only that her ladyship was upset after speaking with Mr. Lacey. They argued, quiet like, but I heard enough to tell it weren't friendly. What was said? Something about a promise broken, and letters that should have stayed lost. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened ever so slightly. Thank you, Mr. Shaw. That's very helpful indeed. 3. The Vicar's Reflections. Reverend Stokes was next, earnest, uneasy, yet clearly eager to be of use. She was troubled, Miss Marple, he said. Deeply so. In confession, well, I mustn't say much of course, but she spoke of remorse. Of a sin from her youth, one she believed was now returning to demand reckoning. Miss Marple inclined her head. A sin of the heart, perhaps. He hesitated. Perhaps. She mentioned a name, Edmund, and said, "He has not forgiven me." I assumed she meant spiritual forgiveness, but now. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. No, you wonder if the past was rather more literal than she confessed. The vicar sighed. It is a strange world, Miss Marple. The heart remembers long after it should forget. It always does, Reverend, she said kindly. And sometimes it kills to make others remember too. For Geoffrey Lacey finally. Geoffrey Lacey. He met Miss Marple's gaze coolly. I understand you have a taste for, what shall we call it? Amateur detection, Miss Marple. Observation, she corrected pleasantly. Of the human condition. He smiled thinly. Then you'll know that my brother's death affected Lady Fortescue greatly. Edmund was her fiancé. When he died she was inconsolable for a time, but life moves on. She married, prospered, and seemed happy enough. And yet you quarrelled with her last night, said Miss Marple mildly. His expression hardened. I asked her to destroy certain letters my brother had written. They were private, youthful things. She refused. Said they were all she had left of him. I warned her they could cause embarrassment if ever made public. How very thoughtful of you, said Miss Marple softly. His jaw tightened. I assure you, I wished her no harm. Of course not, said Miss Marple with that gentle, infuriating certainty that always left men feeling uncertain of their own innocence. The locked door. Later that day, Miss Marple returned to examine the room once more. Alone this time, save for Craddock. The key was in the lock inside, he said. So unless someone had another key, there's no way they could have locked the door after leaving. Miss Marple's eyes roamed over the carpet, the door frame, the writing desk. She paused at the open window. The latch is old, she observed. One might push it open from outside with a long stick. Or perhaps a gardening tool. Through that rose trellis. Craddock frowned. Bit of a climb, true, but love, or hate, has made people attempt much stranger feats, Inspector. As she bent down examining the floor beneath the desk, there, faintly visible in the pile of the carpet, was the imprint of a muddy boot, small, narrow, almost certainly a man's, but not heavy enough for hard labor. Interesting, she murmured. Not the gardener's, I think. Too refined, and yet not the house staff's either. She straightened. Inspector, might I suggest you have a quiet word with the butler? I fancy he knows more than he dares say. The butler speaks. Jameson, the butler, was a tall, discreet man with impeccable manners and the wary air of one who has served too many masters. When questioned, he hesitated only briefly before sighing. If you must know, Miss Marple, her ladyship had a visitor last evening, just after dinner. A man, though I did not see his face clearly. I was told not to announce him. Not to announce him, repeated Miss Marple. Most irregular. Yes, ma'am. He came by the side entrance, stayed perhaps half an hour. And when he left? I cannot say. I was in the pantry when I heard the back door close. When I returned to the hall he was gone. Describe him, if you can. Tall, I think. Wore a dark coat and hat. But what struck me was his manner. Purposeful, like someone coming to settle an old account. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Craddock. An old account indeed, she said. And one perhaps written in the ink of first love. The discovery in the rose garden. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the gardens. The roses glowed pale against the deep green leaves, their scent both sweet and faintly melancholy. She stooped near one of the bushes and noticed something curious. A torn scrap of fabric caught among the thorns. dark wool, coarse weave, not from a lady's gown, perhaps a coat sleeve. She held it delicately between her fingers. "Now who are you, my friend?" she whispered. "Prowling about here last night?" Further along the path, she found a small overturned flower pot, and beneath it, half buried in soil, a crumpled envelope addressed in Lady Fortescue's handwriting. She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, unfinished. "Dearest Edmund, I cannot bear the thought of seeing you again. You must not come. The past is over. I beg you, let it rest." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it neatly. "Well, now," she murmured, "so the dead do write letters after all." A village supper. That evening, the vicarage hosted its customary Thursday supper. Miss Marple attended, as always, with polite interest. The vicar and his wife spoke in hushed tones of Lady Fortescue's tragic end, while Mrs. Price Ridley declared that women of that sort always came to a sticky finish. But Miss Marple was listening to something else entirely. The rhythm of speech, the gaps between words, the tremor in voices when guilt brushed too close. When Geoffrey Lacey mentioned casually that he intended to return to London as soon as the inquest is done, Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "Oh, surely you'll remain a while longer," she said sweetly. "After all, the police haven't yet found the man who visited the hall last night." Lacey stiffened. "Man? What man?" "Oh, didn't you know? He was seen by the butler. Came unannounced through the side door. Such a curious business." There was a flicker in his expression. Quickly masked, but not quick enough. Miss Marple smiled. "Ah well, the truth always finds its way through the hedgerows, doesn't it? Clues and conclusions zero for now." That night, back in her cosy parlor, Miss Marple sat reflecting by the fire. Pieces were beginning to form patterns, imperfect ones, but patterns nonetheless. The roses, left deliberately, symbolically. Whoever placed them knew of Lady Fortescue's past with Edmund Lacey. The poison, digitalis, easily obtained by anyone tending gardens. The letter, half finished, addressed to Geoffrey, referring to Edmund, interrupted, by death or by fear. The visitor, tall man, entered secretly. Could it have been Geoffrey himself, returning after their quarrel, or someone impersonating another? And then, there was the torn fabric, dark wool, perhaps from a coat. The Reverend wore one like it. So did Geoffrey. So, too, did half the men in England. People always assume murder is about hate, Miss Marple thought, sipping her cocoa. But more often, it's about love. Misplaced, disappointed, or betrayed. As she leaned back, the firelight glinting in her eyes. "The first love mystery," she murmured. "Yes, that's what it is. But whose first love, and whose last?" The inquest was brief but revealing. Haydock confirmed digitalis poisoning. Geoffrey testified solemnly, insisting Lady Fortescue had seemed emotionally fragile. Clara Denham wept quietly, declaring her mistress had no enemies. Reverend Stokes spoke of her spiritual torment. When asked about the roses, Peter Shaw swore under oath that he had never placed them there. The coroner seemed unmoved. "A sentimental gesture, perhaps," he said, "or an admirer's fancy." Miss Marple watched it all from the back row, knitting steadily. To her, the most telling moment came when Geoffrey was asked whether Lady Fortescue had mentioned her late fiancé. "She spoke of him only once," Geoffrey said evenly. "She said he had been the only man she ever truly loved." And yet his hand, gripping the edge of the witness stand, trembled. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Aye," she whispered to herself, "so there it is. Jealousy. The oldest motive in the book." A visit to the vicarage. Again that evening, Miss Marple visited Reverend Stokes under pretext of returning a borrowed hymn book. The vicar, ever hospitable, invited her for tea. As he poured, she glanced at the small glass cabinet beside the mantel. Inside it, several vials labeled Digitus Purpurea. "Ah," she said lightly, "you grow foxgloves in your garden, I see." "Yes, for medicinal study. My late uncle was an apothecary." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple. "And did you happen to lend any to Lady Fortescue?" He blinked. "Good heavens, no. Why do you ask?" "Oh, idle curiosity," she said, smiling. "One hears so much about the uses of herbs these days." But as she left the vicarage, she noted how pale he'd grown, and how he locked the cabinet with unnecessary haste. The night revelation that night. The wind rose across St. Mary Mead. Leaves rustled, shutters creaked, and in her small cottage, Miss Marple sat awake, piecing together the puzzle in the flicker of her lamp. Every clue pointed backward, to the past, to a love betrayed, to promises made under rose trellises long ago. She recalled Lady Fortescue's words, "Every young girl makes promises. Some are foolish enough to keep them." What if Edmund Lacey hadn't died at all? What if he'd returned, under another name perhaps to claim what he believed was still his, and what if someone discovered that truth and silenced it? Miss Marple folded her hands and whispered softly to the empty room. The first love has returned, but not in the way anyone thinks. The clock struck midnight. Somewhere in the dark garden beyond her window, an owl called mournfully, and Miss Marple, eyes bright as polished glass, knew that the time had come to test her theory. She would visit Hetherington Hall again tomorrow, unannounced, as the killer had done, and see what secrets the roses were still hiding. For there, among the thorns, lay the truth. The following morning dawned grey and restless over St. Mary Mead. Mist hung low over the hedgerows, and the air was damp with the promise of rain. From her parlour window, Miss Marple could see the vicarage garden glistening with dew, the foxgloves nodding solemnly in the still air. "Ah," she murmured, pulling on her gloves, "rain is always cleansing. Perhaps it will wash away some of the lies." She set out for Hetherington Hall with her umbrella in hand and purpose in her step. The village had already begun to move on. Or so it liked to pretend. The postmistress was telling anyone who'd listen that poor Lady Fortescue had a weak heart, while Mrs. Bartlett claimed it was the will of Providence. Miss Marple, however, believed Providence seldom acted alone. The gates of Hetherington Hall loomed through the mist, black and glistening with rain. She was met this time not by the butler, but by Miss Clara Denham, pale and agitated. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect you," she stammered. "Inspector Craddock has been and gone again this morning. He says the case is closed. Suicide." Miss Marple gave a small, pitying smile. "Men are so eager to close cases, my dear. They dislike untidiness. But truth, I'm afraid, is nearly always untidy." The hidden drawer inside. The atmosphere of the hall felt heavier than before. Curtains were drawn against the drizzle. Clocks ticked solemnly. Miss Marple asked quietly if she might see Lady Fortescue's writing desk once more, just to satisfy a small curiosity. Reluctantly, Clara led her there. The room remained exactly as it had been on the night of the death, save that the white rose had wilted and turned brown at the edges. Miss Marple approached the desk. "You said Lady Fortescue kept letters from Captain Lacey locked away here, did you not?" "Yes," Clara said nervously. "But Inspector Craddock searched and found nothing." "Ah," said Miss Marple gently. "Men search with their eyes, dear, women with their intuition." She ran her fingers lightly along the inside of the drawer, tapping. A hollow sound answered. With the end of a knitting needle, which she produced from her handbag like a magician, she pressed the back panel. A small compartment sprang open. Inside were 3 yellowed letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, and a photograph of a young soldier with laughing eyes. Miss Marple read the first line aloud. "My darling Eleanor, I have your promise, and I will hold you to it, always, in this life or the next." She replaced them carefully. "So," she said softly, "the past was closer than anyone thought." The return of Inspector Craddock. Inspector Craddock arrived not long after, summoned by Clara's frightened call. He found Miss Marple seated calmly at the writing desk, sipping tea. "Miss Marple," he said, "I do wish you'd stop making my life difficult." She smiled sweetly. "I should hate to think I was doing that, Inspector. But I believe you'll find Lady Fortescue's death is far from a closed matter." She showed him the hidden drawer and its contents. Craddock read the letters with furrowed brow. "So she'd been corresponding with Captain Lacey. But he's been dead these 20 years. "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "which raises an interesting question. Who wrote these?" Craddock stared. "You think someone forged them?" "I think," she said mildly, "someone wanted Lady Fortescue to believe her first love had returned from the grave. To torment her, or to draw her into a trap." Craddock rubbed his chin. "That's devilish cunning, Miss Marple." "Yes," she said, "and devilishly human." A ghost from the past that afternoon brought a new twist that sent ripples through the village. A letter arrived at the police station, addressed to the authorities, St. Mary Mead. Its contents were startling. "I am Edmund Lacey. Reports of my death were premature. I have returned to claim what was once mine. Signed simply E. Lacey." Craddock brought the letter straight to Miss Marple. "What do you make of this?" he demanded. She read it slowly, lips pursed. The paper was ordinary, but the handwriting, that told its own tale. "This hand," she said quietly, "is the same as the forged letters to Lady Fortescue. Our ghost has grown bolder." "But why now?" asked Craddock. "Why after all these years?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Because, Inspector, Time softens memories but not guilt. Someone feared Lady Fortescue was about to reveal a truth best kept buried, such as, "Oh," she said delicately, "perhaps that Edmund Lacey never died at all, or that someone else did in his place." War is a convenient cover for such confusions. Craddock groaned. "You're suggesting a living man pretending to be dead, or a dead man whose memory's being used." "Both possibilities," said Miss Marple serenely, "are very much alive." Suspicion in the rain that evening, Miss Marple took a walk around the hall's grounds despite the drizzle. Her umbrella tilted against the wind. She moved slowly past the rose garden, the glasshouse, the gardener's shed. Inside the shed, she found Peter Shaw, startled by her sudden appearance. "Oh, Miss Marple, you gave me a fright." "I'm terribly sorry," she said pleasantly. "I'm afraid I have a rather morbid interest in flowers these days, particularly those that kill." He froze. "You mean Digitalis?" "Yes," she said softly. "You wouldn't happen to know how it found its way into Lady Fortescue's teacup, would you?" His face flushed. "No, ma'am. I swear it. I grow the stuff, yes, but it's kept in the potting shed. Anyone could have taken it." "Indeed," she murmured. "And tell me, Peter, did you know Captain Lacey?" He blinked. "Course not. That was years before my time." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "Curious, because you have his eyes." He stared, confused. "What?" "Nothing," she said quickly. "Merely an observation." "You're dismissed, Mr. Shaw. But do try to remember, secrets have roots, just like roses. They surface eventually." She left him gaping and returned to her cottage with a faint smile. The village whispers by the next morning. Gossip had reached fever pitch. Some said Lady Fortescue had been haunted by a ghost. Others whispered that Peter Shaw was her illegitimate son. Mrs. Price, Ridley, with grim satisfaction, declared that these things always come out in the end. Miss Marple listened to it all with mild amusement, her teacup trembling only slightly as she heard one particularly juicy remark. "Of course," said Mrs. Bartlett, "I always said Geoffrey Lacey had a temper. And didn't he look pale at the inquest? Mark my words, he knows more than he's saying." Indeed, Miss Marple thought, he certainly does. The second incident that afternoon, another shock rocked the hall. Clara Denham, pale and shaking, burst into Miss Marple's cottage with tears streaming down her face.
"It's Mr. Lacey,"
she cried. "He's collapsed. In the library." "They think it's poison." Miss Marple's eyes widened. "Poison, you say? Dear me. That does complicate matters." She hurried to the hall where Geoffrey lay slumped on the carpet, pale but breathing. Dr. Haydock was already attending him. "He'll live," the doctor said grimly. "Small dose of Digitalis. Not enough to kill, thank heaven." A Craddock arrived moments later, furious. "This is getting out of hand. Either there's a lunatic at large, or, said Miss Marple calmly, someone's trying to silence the man who knows too much." She looked at Geoffrey's hand, clenched even in unconsciousness. "He's holding something," she said softly. Craddock pried it open. Inside was a small silver locket, engraved with the initials E.L., the locket's secret. Later that evening, Miss Marple examined the locket by lamplight in her parlor. Inside, beneath the tiny portrait of a young soldier, was a lock of fair hair, and a faded note folded beneath the miniature, "Forgive me, my love. I could not keep the promise." Miss Marple sighed. "Aye, and promises, like ghosts, never rest quietly." She thought of Peter Shaw's fair hair, of Lady Fortescue's haunting guilt, of Geoffrey's anger, of the forged letters. Slowly, the pieces began to arrange themselves in her mind like a pattern in lace. But there was still one stitch missing, one small, invisible thread that connected them all. And then she remembered, the letter on Lady Fortescue's desk. "There is something I must tell you about Edmund." What if that something was not about Edmund's past, but his legacy? A child, a revelation beneath the roses. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to Hetherington Hall one last time. The gardener's shed was empty, the ground muddy from rain. She followed the narrow path to the rose garden. There she found Peter Shaw kneeling before a bush, pruning shears in hand, trimming away dead blooms. "Mr. Shaw," she said softly, "you needn't be afraid. I think I understand now." He turned, startled. "Understand what?" "That you were not her enemy. You were her son." He froze, color draining from his face. "Who told you that?" "No one," she said gently. "But the resemblance is undeniable. Fair hair, same eyes as the photograph. You were born after Captain Lacey's supposed death, were you not? Your mother arranged your adoption quietly. Lady Fortescue's shame, hidden under her husband's respectability." He said nothing. The pruning shears trembled in his hand. She wanted to tell Geoffrey. Miss Marple continued softly. To make things right before she died. That's why she wrote the letter. But someone discovered the truth, and feared what it would mean. Someone who would lose everything if her son inherited the fortune meant for the Lacys. He looked up, anguish in his eyes. Mr. Lacey. Miss Marple nodded. He stood to inherit everything as her nearest relation by marriage. But if you were acknowledged, he would lose it all. So he revived a ghost, forged letters from Edmund, made her believe the past was haunting her. When she planned to confess the truth, he poisoned her. And when he realized you might suspect, he poisoned himself, but only slightly, to divert suspicion. Peter dropped the shears. But how can you prove it? Oh, quite easily, said Miss Marple, pointing delicately to the cut on his hand. That thorn, the one you pruned yesterday, it holds traces of digitalis, the same thorn Geoffrey used to apply poison to the teacup, pretending to place the rose. Peter stared at her in awe. You're saying he pricked the stem with poison? Yes, she said calmly. A rose, symbol of love, turned into an instrument of death. Rather poetic, don't you think? A trap is set that evening. Under Miss Marple's direction, Craddock arranged a little gathering at Hitherington Hall. The guests, Clara Denham, Reverend Stokes, Peter Shaw, and Geoffrey Lacey, sat around the drawing room, uneasy and waiting. Miss Marple, seated by the fire, looked up with her customary mildness. My dear friends, she said, we are gathered here not merely to mourn, but to understand. Lady Fortescue's death was not self-inflicted, it was deliberate, planned with a lover's care and a murderer's precision. Geoffrey's face went white. You have no proof. On the contrary, said Miss Marple gently, I have every proof I need. She held up the locket. You knew of this, didn't you? You found it among her things. You knew it meant she had borne Edmund's child. And that child lived. Peter Shaw. A gasp rippled around the room. Peter stared at Geoffrey, stunned. You feared exposure. Miss Marple went on. So you composed letters, pretended Edmund was alive, and played upon her conscience. Then, the night she planned to confess, you brought her a rose. The poisoned rose. You used a thorn dipped in digitalis to prick the stem, knowing she'd handle it with bare fingers, that the poison would seep through the skin. She died hours later alone, believing herself haunted by her past. Geoffrey surged to his feet. You can't prove that. Craddock stepped forward, holding a small envelope. We can. This was found in your study. The bottle of digitalis from Reverend Stokes's cabinet, and the waxed gloves you used. Geoffrey's face crumpled. She was going to ruin everything, he whispered. All for that boy, her bastard. Miss Marple's voice was soft, but firm. First love is never a sin, Mr. Lacey, only what one does with it afterward. He sagged defeated. She said Edmund's son would inherit what was rightfully his. I couldn't let that happen. Craddock took him gently by the arm. You'll come with me now. Aftermath. When they were gone, Miss Marple turned to Peter Shaw. He stood silently, tears streaking his face. She loved you, Miss Marple said gently. You must believe that. Her silence was born of shame, not lack of love. He nodded slowly. I suppose she tried to protect me. Yes, Miss Marple said. And in doing so, she left you the one thing no one could take, the truth. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky, washed clean, glowed faintly with twilight. Miss Marple looked through the window at the rose garden, where the blooms hung heavy with raindrops. Poor child, she murmured, how cruelly love binds us. Even after death, its thorns draw blood. The calm after the storm. For 2 days after Geoffrey Lacey's arrest, the village of St. Mary Mead seemed to breathe again. The gossip had quieted, the newspapers had printed their lurid headlines. Country gentlemen arrested in Hyras's death. And life resumed its familiar, comforting rhythm of church bells, hedgerows, and teapots. Yet Miss Marple knew that the business was far from finished. She sat quietly one morning by her parlour window, knitting a pale blue scarf, her needles clicking like a ticking clock. Her mind was turning, as it always did after such events, not on guilt or innocence, but on understanding, because in Miss Marple's world, evil was rarely monstrous. It was simply human nature, a little gone astray. When Inspector Craddock stopped by that afternoon, she greeted him with her usual warm smile and a plate of shortbread. He took one gratefully and said, You've done it again, Miss Marple. I can't say I know how you do it, but you've done it. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Oh, it's not so very difficult, Inspector. Human nature, you see, is much the same everywhere. in St. Mary Mead or London, or even in a manor house with fine carpets. If one simply watches long enough, it always tells on itself. Craddock smiled ruefully. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, she replied serenely. Only, people refuse to look where the truth hides, in small things. A pause too long, a word too kind, a rose too perfect. A visit to Hetherington Hall. Miss Marple returned to Hetherington Hall at the invitation of Clara Denham, who had taken charge of settling Lady Fortescue's affairs. The house was quieter now, though its silence felt softer, less haunted. Clara met her at the door. I can't thank you enough, Miss Marple, she said earnestly. If you hadn't seen through it all, I shudder to think what might have happened next. My dear, said Miss Marple kindly, I merely followed where truth led me. You, on the other hand, were quite brave. That must not be forgotten. Clara blushed faintly. I don't feel brave, just sad. I keep thinking of Lady Fortescue. She had such kindness, but she hid it beneath so much pride. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, she was a woman of her time. Duty before desire, appearance before affection. It's a common ailment among gentlewomen, I'm afraid. They are taught to feel shame for being human. They walked through the house together. The grand staircases, the long gallery, the parlour where Lady Fortescue had once held her teas, every corner whispered memories. I've been sorting through her papers, said Clara. Would you like to see something rather touching? She handed Miss Marple a small notebook, its leather cover worn with age. Inside were pages of delicate handwriting, diary entries, confessions of the heart. Miss Marple read aloud softly. Today, I dreamed of Edmund again. He stood in the garden beneath the roses, smiling. I wish I could tell Peter the truth, that he was born of love, not shame. But the past holds me fast, as it always has. Miss Marple closed the book gently. So she did mean to tell him. She was trying to set things right before she died. Yes, Clara whispered. And that's what Geoffrey feared. The inspector's doubts. Later that day, Inspector Craddock joined them, bringing new developments. We've confirmed the digitalis came from Reverend Stokes's locked medicine cabinet, he said. Geoffrey had a key. And the gloves had traces of the same poison. Miss Marple nodded. As I suspected. But there's still one point I can't make sense of, Craddock admitted. Why go to such elaborate lengths? The forged letters, the ghostly messages. Why not simply poison her quietly? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because, my dear Inspector, this crime was not born of practicality, but emotion. Geoffrey was not content to kill Lady Fortescue. He wanted to punish her, to make her suffer the same torment she had inflicted on others. Craddock frowned. Torment? Miss Marple nodded. Geoffrey was once engaged to Clara Denham, years ago, before she became Lady Fortescue's companion. Eleanor, that's Lady Fortescue, forbade the marriage, said Clara was beneath him. It humiliated him deeply. That wound never healed. Craddock blinked. Are you saying revenge played a part? Part and parcel, said Miss Marple serenely. You see, when he discovered that Eleanor herself had committed the very sin she condemned, bearing a child out of wedlock, he could not forgive the hypocrisy. He decided she must pay for it, and that her downfall would be poetic, through her own first love. Craddock exhaled slowly. Good Lord, yes, said Miss Marple, eyes soft with sadness. There's nothing quite so cruel as the righteousness of the wronged. The rose garden revisited. That afternoon, Miss Marple wandered alone into the rose garden, where Lady Fortescue had breathed her last. The air was fragrant with late blooms. Bees hummed lazily, indifferent to tragedy. She paused by the central rosebush, the one with the silver plaque, Edmund's rose. The thorns gleamed wetly in the sunlight. It was here that love had first bloomed, and here that it had turned deadly. The symbolism was almost too neat. Miss Marple knelt down and brushed the soil. Her sharp eyes noticed something half buried near the base. A small silver cufflink, tarnished by rain. She picked it up and turned it in her palm. Engraved on it were the initials GL. So, she murmured, or Mr. Lacey must have lost this when he leaned to prick the rose. She slipped it into her bag, not out of necessity. The case was already solved, but out of completeness. To her every story deserved to end tidily, every thread tied off. Human hearts were rarely neat, but evidence could be. Confrontation with Reverend Stokes that evening. Miss Marple paid a visit to Reverend Stokes, who was polishing the brass candlesticks in his dimly lit vicarage. My dear Miss Marple, he said with weary affection, you've lifted quite the shadow from this village. I'm not sure shadows ever lift entirely, she replied quietly. They simply move. He sighed. Yes, poor Eleanor. I officiated her wedding, you know. She was radiant. And yet, even then there was sadness behind her smile. She lived a divided life. Miss Marple said softly. Duty on one side, love on the other. Do you think she found peace at the end? He asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I should like to think so. Perhaps she found Edmund again. In whatever heaven forgives both passion and pride. The Reverend looked away, mist in his eyes. You always see the soul behind the sin, Miss Marple. Because, she said gently, the two are never far apart. The confession of Clara Denham. As Miss Marple turned to leave, Clara Denham came rushing up the path, breathless and pale. Miss Marple, there's something you must know, something I should have told the police. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Yes, my dear. It's about Lady Fortescue's will, she said, trembling. I found a second copy in her desk. It was never signed, but it leaves everything to Peter Shaw. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Ah, then she truly meant to acknowledge him. Yes, Clara whispered. And Geoffrey must have found out. He was furious when she asked me to fetch her solicitor that afternoon. Miss Marple nodded. That was the trigger then. He realized his inheritance was lost. He had to act quickly. But there's more, Clara said. There was a note beside the unsigned will, in her handwriting. It said, if I do not live to sign this, I want Jane Marple to know the truth. Miss Marple's hand trembled slightly as she took the note. Oh dear me, she murmured. How very kind, and how very tragic. She must have known deep down that death was coming. An evening reflection that night. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire with a cup of cocoa, the note open beside her. The flames flickered across her face as she pondered. She thought of Lady Fortescue, proud, remorseful, lonely. Of Peter Shaw, an innocent soul caught in the web of others' sins. Of Geoffrey Lacey, eaten alive by resentment. And of Clara, who had witnessed it all with quiet pain. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a most human tragedy. She recalled something her dear friend the vicar's wife had once said. Love is a garden, Jane. It blooms, it withers, it pricks. And yes, Miss Marple thought, sometimes it kills. But still, she pitied Geoffrey Lacey. He had not been born wicked. He had simply allowed bitterness to curdle into evil. The final puzzle piece. The next morning brought a letter from Scotland Yard. Craddock had written, we've confirmed every detail of your theory. Geoffrey has confessed to forging the letters, obtaining the poison, and planting the rose. He even admitted to staging his own poisoning, to divert suspicion. The case is closed. I owe you another cup of tea, or perhaps a medal. Miss Marple smiled as she folded the letter. She didn't need medals. Tea was quite enough. Yet one question lingered. Why had Lady Fortescue written to her solicitor at all? Surely she could have confided in Clara, or even the vicar. Why involve an outsider? The answer came like a whisper from memory years ago. Eleanor Fortescue had attended a charity tea at St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had been there, too. They had spoken about lost loves and the passage of time. Eleanor had confided then, if ever I have a secret too heavy to bear, Miss Marple, I should like you to keep it. Miss Marple smiled to herself. How very curious that life should circle back upon itself. Miss Marple's deduction, reconstruction of the crime. A week later, at Inspector Craddock's request, Miss Marple agreed to explain the entire affair, for the official record. They sat together in the vicarage drawing room while Reverend Stokes took notes. Let us begin at the beginning, Miss Marple said. Lady Fortescue had long lived under the shadow of her youthful affair with Captain Edmund Lacey. When he was declared missing in the Great War, she married Sir Thomas Fortescue and bore a child in secret, Peter Shaw, whom she arranged to be adopted. Her husband never knew. Only her old friend, the family nurse, was aware, and she swore never to speak. Years later, after Sir Thomas's death, Lady Fortescue took Clara Denham as her companion. Geoffrey Lacey, Edmund's nephew, became her sole heir. When Lady Fortescue began corresponding with her solicitor about legitimizing her son, Geoffrey discovered the truth, and realized that if Peter were recognized, he would inherit everything. Revenge and greed mingled with his bitterness. He forged letters in Captain Lacey's hand, pretending Edmund was still alive. The letters preyed upon Lady Fortescue's conscience, weakening her mind. Then, on the day she planned to confess, Geoffrey brought her a white rose, Edmund's rose, as a cruel symbol of her lost love. He had pricked one thorn with digitalis and, while placing it in a vase near her tea, ensured the poison would enter her bloodstream when she handled it. Later, to divert suspicion, he staged his own poisoning, taking a small dose of digitalis to appear another victim. But he miscalculated, as such men often do. His guilt betrayed him in the smallest things. The missing cufflink, the ink smudges from the forged letters, his nervous talk of ghosts. And of course, his hatred, which no man can conceal forever. When she finished, there was silence in the room. Even Craddock looked momentarily humbled. "Brilliant," he said quietly. "And tragic. Most tragedies," said Miss Marple, "begin with love and end with pride." A quiet farewell in the weeks that followed. Hetherington Hall passed into Peter Shaw's care. He decided to keep only the rose garden and a few family portraits, selling the rest to charity. The villagers, as villagers do, adjusted quickly, discussing him for a fortnight and then moving on to the next wedding or scandal. One afternoon, he came to see Miss Marple before leaving for London. "I don't know how to thank you," he said earnestly. "You gave me back my mother, even if only through the truth." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Truth is a poor substitute for love, my dear. But it is the only thing that lasts." He nodded, eyes bright. "I'll remember that." She watched him walk down the lane, tall and fair-haired, sunlight glinting on his shoulders. The very image of Edmund Lacey. She sighed softly. "Ah, the sins of the fathers, and the loves of their mothers." Evening in St. Mary Mead. As dusk fell, Miss Marple took her tea in the garden. The air was cool, filled with the scent of honeysuckle. The world was quiet again, as though it had exhaled after holding its breath. She reflected, as she often did, on the curious pattern of life that love, which was meant to heal, could so easily destroy. And yet, she thought, without it the world would be unbearably cold. A blackbird sang somewhere beyond the hedge, a plaintive, wistful note. Miss Marple smiled faintly and murmured, "There is always a first love, and it never truly dies." The church bell chimed 7, and she rose to draw her curtains. Her fire crackled gently as she settled down with her knitting once more. Another mystery laid to rest, another heart mended, in its own way. And outside, beneath the gathering twilight, the roses bloomed once more, white, fragrant, innocent, as if nothing tragic had ever touched them. The drawing-room revelation the morning following the sleepless night was one of extraordinary calm. A thin mist lay across the meadows like gauze, and the world seemed cleansed and distant. Miss Marple, dressed in dove, grey with a neat lace collar, took her seat by the great bay window of the Rosewood drawing-room. Her knitting needles clicked softly, though it was clear her mind was far from her yarn. One by one the household assembled. Lady Winifred in black crepe, her hands tightly clasped, Charles Denham, pale but defiant, Caroline Whitmore, visibly nervous, her eyes darting towards the door as if seeking escape, Dr. Lionel Hartley, composed yet uneasy, and the vicar, Mr. Pembroke, whose kindly face bore a troubled crease of confusion. Detective Inspector Crail, grave and formal, stood at the mantelpiece, arms folded. Miss Marple's quiet voice broke the tension. "I believe," she said softly, "it is time we put to rest the mystery that has haunted this house." Her words seemed to ripple through the room like a quiet breeze disturbing stagnant air. Crail nodded. "Go ahead, Miss Marple. We're all ears." The puzzle assembled. Miss Marple's eyes wandered over them, her expression kindly, almost wistful. "It has been my experience," she began, "that crimes committed under the guise of love are often the most tragic. One cannot quite separate affection from obsession, nor admiration from envy." She placed her knitting down and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "When Colonel Whitmore died," she continued, "it seemed, on the surface, a heart failure brought on by stress. But there were too many small details that disagreed. A misplaced glass, a note missing from the deceased's desk, a bottle of tonic slightly tampered with. And then, of course, the curious matter of the blue forget-me nots." Caroline trembled. "What of them?" she asked, her voice sharp. "The flower of remembrance," Miss Marple said gently. "You see, the Colonel was to meet someone that night, someone from his past, someone connected to his first love." Lady Winifred gasped. "You mean, to me?" "No, my dear Lady Winifred," Miss Marple said, with a small smile. "Not to you, to another." The air seemed to vanish from the room. Charles frowned. "Another? But who?" "The name Eleanor Grant," Miss Marple said softly, "appeared once, in the Colonel's letters, a youthful romance, long before your marriage, Lady Winifred. Miss Eleanor Grant later became Mrs. Caroline Whitmore." Every head turned. Caroline's eyes widened in horror, her lips parting but no sound emerging. "Yes," Miss Marple said calmly, "you were the Colonel's first love." Love turned to bitterness. "I was very young," Caroline whispered, trembling. "It was years ago, We were engaged, once, but his mother disapproved. She said I was beneath him. I married his cousin instead, Arthur Whitmore. I never saw Edward again until last year, at the flower show." Miss Marple nodded. "You rekindled old memories. I imagine the encounter was both tender and painful. You realized how deeply he had resented the past. He wrote you letters, and you corresponded secretly, until someone else discovered it." Caroline's eyes darted to Lady Winifred, but Miss Marple shook her head. Not Lady Winifred. She was blissfully unaware. It was Charles. Charles stiffened.
"That's absurd."
"Is it?" Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "You'd been struggling financially. You hoped your stepfather might help. Instead, you found a letter that implied he intended to alter his will, cutting you out and leaving everything to a certain lady friend. When you confronted him, he refused to explain. In anger and despair, you spied upon him that evening from the terrace, and saw him meet Mrs. Whitmore in the library." The Charles's face drained of color. "I didn't. I never meant." He stammered. "You didn't kill him, Mr. Denham," Miss Marple said, "but your actions set the tragedy in motion." IV. The poisoned glass. Dr. Hartley, who had remained silent until now, spoke coldly. "Surely, Miss Marple, you don't mean to suggest that Mrs. Whitmore poisoned him?" She interrupted, her voice serene. "Yes, I do, with the digitalis she took from your surgery." A faint murmur went around the room. Hartley rose to his feet, eyes blazing.
"That's a monstrous accusation!"
"I'd have known if—" Miss Marple raised a hand. "You were too distracted, Doctor. You see, Mrs. Whitmore was a volunteer at your dispensary. A charitable position she used rather cleverly. She signed out medicine for an elderly parishioner, which she never delivered. The bottle was later returned, empty." Caroline's breath came in shallow gasps. "He was going to ruin everything," she cried suddenly. "He threatened to tell Arthur. To destroy what little peace I had left. I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted him to feel what I had felt, regret, remorse, humiliation." The confession came with a torrent of tears. Lady Winifred stared in disbelief. "You killed my husband because of an old romance."
"It wasn't romance."
Caroline sobbed. "It was revenge for a life stolen by pride." The final twist. Crail stepped forward. "That settles it then. Mrs. Whitmore, you'll come with." But Miss Marple shook her head. "I'm afraid it isn't quite so simple, Inspector." The room froze. Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened with quiet intensity. "Mrs. Whitmore administered the poison, yes. But she was not the only one to act that night. There was another hand at play, another motive altogether." "Another," Crail repeated, astonished. She nodded. "The colonel was already dying. Mrs. Whitmore's dose, diluted and desperate, might have weakened him, but it wasn't enough to kill. The true fatal blow came from someone who, in his own way, sought mercy rather than malice." Her gaze fell upon Dr. Hartley. He stood utterly still. "You, Doctor, found him moments before death," Miss Marple continued gently. "You saw the signs, and realized he'd been poisoned. He begged you to spare his wife the scandal. You promised you would, so you made it appear as though it was heart failure. But when Mrs. Whitmore returned later, hysterical, you realized what she'd done, and that you had already fulfilled her unspoken wish. The guilt, I imagine, has eaten at you ever since." Dr. Hartley's face crumpled. He sank into the nearest chair. "He was my friend," he whispered. "He begged me not to let her hang. I couldn't bear it. I thought, if I said nothing, it would die with him." The first love mystery unveiled. Miss Marple sighed softly. "And so it nearly did. But truth, I've found, has a way of surfacing, like a lost letter found behind a drawer." She turned to Caroline, her voice kind but firm. "Yours was not love, my dear. It was memory dressed as affection. You mourned what might have been, not what was." Then to Dr. Hartley, "And yours was mercy twisted by guilt. You meant to save her, but in doing so, you condemned yourself to lifelong torment." Inspector Crail exhaled slowly. "Well, that's quite the story, Miss Marple. I'll have to make a formal report, of course. But with the colonel gone, and Mrs. Whitmore's confession incomplete, I dare say justice will find a delicate form." Miss Marple nodded. "Justice," she said softly, "sometimes gentler than the law." The village returns to quiet. The scandal rippled through Charnley Hollow, as all scandals must, and then faded like morning mist. Lady Winifred moved to Bath, where her sister kept a small house. Charles took up a modest post abroad. Dr. Hartley retired quietly, his once steady hands trembling ever so slightly. As for Caroline Whitmore, she was never charged. The coroner's inquest listed the cause as natural. She left the village soon after, leaving behind only a faded photograph of her younger self, tucked into a prayer book in the parish pew. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to St. Mary Mead, and though she rarely spoke of the Rosewood affair, she often reflected upon it in her garden, pruning roses and watching the light fade across the fields. Miss Marple's reflection. It was one evening, some weeks later, as she poured her tea by the window, that she murmured to herself, "The first love, such a tender, perilous thing. It begins in innocence and ends, more often than not, in regret." She looked out at the sunset, her blue eyes calm. "People always think first love is purest," she mused, "but it is also the most dangerous. For we never quite see the person, only our dream of them. And dreams, when betrayed by time, can turn cruel." Her tabby cat purred on the windowsill. The kettle hissed. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow a church bell chimed softly. Miss Marple smiled faintly and took a sip of her tea. "Ah well," she said, "we must all learn. The heart, like the garden, must sometimes be pruned to bloom again." And with that quiet observation, the village of St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple's gentle wisdom, returned once more to peace.